Brendan, thanks for coming on again.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes, it's great to have you on a second time. For listeners who aren't aware, we spoke about 8 months ago or so and mostly covered, let's see, your origin story. We went really deep into your past, into your early life, and then also your book on emergentism. And it was a wonderful conversation. I recommend people listen to that after this one, or maybe before, just swap back. I learned so much, and it's great to be speaking with you again. And this time we're going to cover your brand new book, Metamodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. And so to get us kicked off, I have two questions to set the table, and then we'll dive very deep into the book. So first off, what is metamodernism?
What is metamodernism? So I actually saved that specific question for the last chapter of the book in terms of
Yes.
what is this thing that we're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll say something like metamodernism is what comes after postmodernism. And it's a moving beyond postmodernism by means of postmodernism, I guess would be one way of describing it. And so one of the things I do in this book is look at these different strands of people talking about metamodernism, people coming from cultural studies, people coming from philosophy, people coming from complexity theory, etc. And so people have sort of a different take on what is metamodernism. And yet, despite the differences, there's also a lot of overlap. So this book is really trying to find some synergy, synthesis, bridging these different ideas, showing what they have in common, and that sort of a thing. But in some ways, what is metamodernism is one of the more difficult questions to ask because those different thinkers kind of define it differently. So you kind of have to see past some of those differences to see what it is about. Now, that's not a hedge. I'm happy to get into, say, more about what it is and all that, but just kind of upfront. It's a difficult balancing act because like talking about, I don't know, modernity or post-modernity, right? These are big words that have a lot of spread. They're covering a lot of content and material, and people have different ideas and that sort of a thing. So up front, I'll give the caveat that things that I'll say, I'm going to have to speak in sort of broad gestures sometimes, and then we can kind of double click on things and get more fine-grained and granular because like any of these things, people saying, oh, postmodernism is this, or, what have you. It's like, well, who says and why and that sort of a thing. So similarly with metamodernism, there's some parsing that needs to be done. But broadly speaking, metamodernism is the sort of thing that when people talk about culture and they say they're talking about categories, periods, they're talking about cultural logics, which is the term I use in the title. It's the same sort of term that people use when they talk about, oh, look at this postmodern art, or this is a very kind of postmodern book, or modern, etc. So if you think in terms of modern, postmodern, metamodern, you're in the right ballpark, and then we can kind of zoom in on what it is.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think it's, I think you had mentioned to me in our first conversation. One way to think about it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not sure if this is in the book, in your brand new book. Modernity is a thesis, postmodernity is an antithesis, and metamodernity is a synthesis. Would you still say that's a decent way of looking at it, or has it changed?
I do think that that's a good approach. And so I think that that's let's say at a very kind of high level, looking down, bird's eye view, that's a great way of thinking about it. That modernity sets up certain ideas, and kind of ways of being, ways of thinking, ways of knowing. Postmodernity comes along, critiques those, sort of does this negative move, deconstructs them, kind of knocks its feet out from under it. And then metamodernism or metamodernity comes along and sort of brings them together in an interesting way so that you have elements of both kind of side by side interacting. And one of the things that I do think is interesting actually is that language has been used by a lot of people talking about metamodernism as well. And I do focus a bit on that in the book in terms of a number of thinkers. Almost all of them actually use some form of that language, which goes back to Hegel, dialectics and stuff. It's kind of a simplified take on what Hegel was talking about. And so, I sometimes, again, I want to respect also the slight differences of point of view that some of these thinkers come from too. So there is one camp that's kind of hesitant about speaking about metamodernism as a synthesis. I think because they really want to emphasize its kind of instability, its sort of dynamism. And that's the kind of cultural studies take, where they're looking in the arts and they're emphasizing the oscillation that goes on between modernism and postmodernism that defines the metamodern. But that's actually kind of an outlier position. I think that most of the approaches see it as some kind of a synthesis, that it's a moving forward as culture progresses, and it's sort of integrating the insights of both modernity and postmodernity, while also trying to sort of move beyond its impasses or kind of weaknesses or something. So, but broadly speaking, yeah, I think that that's a great way of thinking about it.
Okay, awesome. And so I'd say that two questions get us kicked off a little bit. One was what is metamodern, and I think we got a pretty good definition for the folks listening, especially for folks who are brand new to this topic. I will say I did get a chance. You gave me a preview of your book a week or two ago, and I've read it, and I loved it. I thought it was fantastic, and I highly recommend people go out, and I'll put the link in the description below for folks who want to pick it up, and you should, because these are, in my opinion, pretty complex topics. I mean, it spans the gamut, but you do an excellent job. I love your writing style. You're able to, as much as possible, simplify complex topics and ideas, and then make it interesting. And there's a real flow to your writing style that, compels me to just keep going. And I really enjoyed it. Yeah, a lot of these topics can be fairly, I'd say, inaccessible, but you make them as accessible as possible. So.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That was something I was definitely trying to do with this book, and it's very easy to sound just pretentious and just overbearing or something when you're talking about postmodernism and post-postmodernism, metamodernism. It can sound very ridiculous, actually.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to kind of talk about it as down to earth as possible. And I think for your listeners, if they're tuning into that, or your people who watch your podcast tuning into this and familiar with the sort of stuff that you've been engaging with, another thing I'll say up front is sort of like one of the things I think metamodernism is a cultural logic or a worldview that incorporates a lot of the sorts of ideas you explore on this podcast into its sort of perspective. I think that they're becoming very vital to this emerging worldview. And the last chapter of my book talks about metamodernism as sort of like a new way of looking at the world, which is sort of what we find ourselves in. It's sort of the cutting edge of thought right now. And so your podcast is exploring those sorts of ideas, and the kinds of people that you have on here are exploring those sorts of ideas and fit within this worldview, a lot of which has to do with complexity. So metamodernism is both a complex idea. It's also about complexity in some ways. But I just wanted to frame that a little bit for people watching this, being like, what does this have to do with, all these other kind of thinkers that have been on here? And I think that if you're into the kinds of thinkers who show up on this podcast, I think that they fit comfortably in the sort of metamodern perspective, asking the certain kinds of questions at a certain level of complexity and exploring certain kinds of issues. So I'll throw that out there as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's perfect. And also sort of a plug for previous episodes, because I've spoken with, let's say, Bobby Azarian and Greg Henriquez, who are featured prominently in the book and one of the middle chapters, the complexity ones. So that's fantastic. And now the second question is sort of set the table, and then I want to dive deeper into metamodernism. And actually, bring up some critiques in a little bit, not so much of the book, but about metamodernism in general. But can you help the audience just to get a sense of what the central thesis of your book is?
Sure. So my central thesis is, I was going to say twofold, but maybe there's more than twofold, threefold. It's trying to do a couple things. I'll set it up that way. It's trying to offer people an introduction to metamodern discourse, and so give people a lay of the land of who are the people talking about metamodernism, what are their ideas, what do they say metamodernism is. That's goal number one. And then goal number two is sort of my attempt to also synthesize all these different strands of the discourse, to really say, what do they all have in common? What are they all gesturing towards? Despite the differences, what seems to be the deeper structure that underlies them all? So that would be like where my thesis would come in, which is in how I try to unify these different frames of metamodern thought. And there, my thesis is essentially that there's a process underway in culture that I call eternal recursion, or it's a process of reflexive abstraction, which is basically the going meta move, right? So we're talking about metamodernism, but this is what has happened sort of, at all points in cultural transformations in the past, is that you'll have a certain kind of worldview, a way of seeing the world, sets of ideas, etc., that pertain or obtain over a very long period of time. People slowly become aware of the ideas that are prevalent in shaping their culture. They can kind of reflect on them and objectify them, kind of take them as an object of thought, and then kind of critique them, see what they're missing, and try to move beyond them. And that this process sort of unfolds iteratively. It keeps occurring on itself. So, for example, modernity is in large part a reaction to, a response to the pre-modern world, the traditional kind of cultural logic, let's say. If you want to use it as like a very geographically or kind of culturally specific example, you could look at sort of Europe, in the transition from the Middle Ages or the medieval period to the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. A lot of people see that period as sort of the shift into modernity. And a lot of what goes on in that period is sort of people reflecting on what had come before. Petrarch, coined, I think, the phrase "the Dark Ages," which isn't, much held these days in terms of the conversations around the medieval period. But it was a very intentional demarcation point of, we used to look at the world this way, and now we're looking at it this way. And of course, the Renaissance was very self-aware of itself in that sense too. There were a lot of debates around, the ancients versus the moderns and who's better and all this stuff. But the point being that, people became aware of the fact that culture had been a certain way for a long time, and now they were able to sort of reflect on that. To be looking at that means that they were able to not be looking through it, is one way of framing it, right? If we have a sort of a certain lens that we're seeing the world through, and then eventually we can become aware of the lenses that we're using, that's sort of this moment of reflection that you're able to reflexively abstract what you were looking through, now you're looking at. And then in the process, I can see, oh, this wasn't just, this wasn't reality, this was a lens. And now I can see what's outside the lens. So you get more into your purview. And then my thesis, essentially, is that this is just what happens in culture naturally over time, is that we keep doing this. And so when we talk about the pre-modern, the modern, the postmodern, and now the metamodern, these have just been successive instances where basically collective cultural shifts have occurred by the process of reflecting on what had been sort of the way people were seeing the world previously, and then trying to sort of expand the frame, get beyond it, see the lenses rather than see through them. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to say here. Now, then I try to tie this into understanding the different conversations about what metamodernism is and how it works through that lens. Basically is saying that this basic process is sort of what we can see all these different thinkers kind of gesturing towards or assuming, but I'm just trying to make it very explicit and kind of use it as the means to kind of unify these different threads of the discourse. Hope that makes sense. I can say more about that if you want, but
it does. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And we'll get into so many of these specifics in a bit. And I think your book does a great job of giving a history of the emergence of metamodernism and giving credit where it's due across the board, and then kind of explaining where we are today. It tracks a very interesting path. And I'd say one of the things, this occurs a few times in the book, this phrase, and I'm sure we'll get to it, the recursive transcendence through iterative self-reflection. I'm sure that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And so I think what it makes sense is maybe we'll talk about different topics and then we'll return to that.
Sure.
And kind of help folks grok that entire statement, which is a lot to take in at once. Yeah. Okay, awesome. So we're going to dive into the book, and I'm sure we'll weave the book in through this discussion. But I have a few questions about metamodernism itself, and we'll go through digressions, but I have some pressing thoughts about it. And first, to further set the table here, I believe you said on a podcast, it's hard for me to remember which one because I listened to a few of your interviews and prep for this, that in the last 5 years or so, cultural theorists had pretty much come to a consensus on labeling this period as metamodernism. And can you help us understand how this came to be?
Sure. And that's my conclusion. And this is a living discourse that's developing, right? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
framing that in some ways, but I
Mm-hmm.
can make a case for it.
Yeah.
So, because I've been around this discourse now for about 10 years actually, because I became aware of it in 2013, so that requires just a little bit of historical context. There's an interesting thing on the one hand where once you, and this is a product of recursive reflection, once you can name something, you can also then think about what's beyond it. So basically, as soon as you could start talking about postmodernism, which was happening, in the 70s and into the 80s, then people were able to cognize, well, that's postmodernism. There's got to be something after postmodernism, right? But that was relatively early. Now, in the period of like the 80s into the 90s, that's sort of the flourishing of kind of postmodern culture, especially in the arts, let's say. And towards the end of the 90s, you had a number of people who, by this point, the term postmodernism had been around for a while. People had become increasingly aware of it, reflecting on it, et cetera. And then people were saying, okay, yeah, that was a thing. And now it's sort of like, we get it. What next? And so David Foster Wallace was actually a pioneer in some of this thinking. He wrote a great essay, which I'd highly recommend if people are interested in this sort of stuff, called E Unibus Plurum.
Oh, yes.
And
I've read
he talks
it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's a great essay.
One, a dense one. He's my favorite writer. He's my favorite author.
Oh, interesting.
So,
cool.
Yeah. But that one is a tough one for me.
Yeah, so a lot of people look at his writing as being sort of a precursor to a gesture towards this metamodern shift. And, there's some conversations, interviews with David Foster Wallace talking about postmodernism and being like, yeah, okay, now we've got to move beyond the irony, basically. That he saw it as this corrosive thing. And so there were people already trying to move beyond it, aware of what postmodernism was, but also gesturing beyond it. You get Linda Hutchin in the second edition of her book, The Politics of was it The Politics of Postmodernism? I think it is. Basically saying, okay, it's over. The postmodern moment has kind of come and gone, and now there's this new thing that's going to come after it. We don't know what it's called. We're just call it postmodernism for now, but it's up for sort of the next generation of thinkers to kind of name this and make sense of it. So basically, in the late 90s, you get this sense that people are aware that postmodernism's day is sort of over. The wave is crested. And then you start getting people then in this conversation around, okay, well, if postmodernism's dead, what comes after? And so you have some early people articulating some ideas. Alan Kirby puts forward this idea of digimodernism. You get this idea of hypermodernism. There are a couple sort of people writing books and articles and stuff, sort of proposing certain ways of what comes after postmodernism. And arguably, none of these really stuck. People were throwing a bunch of things at the wall, and it's like, well, what sticks? And I think that at this point now we're in 2023, it seems very clear to me that metamodernism has stuck. And I think it's stuck because it's been a very successful framework for understanding cultural production in the last 20 years. So basically, you get this article in 2010 by these Dutch cultural theorists called Notes on Metamodernism. And they basically offer this, as they say, like an intervention into the debate around what comes after postmodernism. And they name, okay, people have said this, and then they propose some trends that they're seeing, and they name it metamodernism. And then that began this sort of seminal, lineage of a certain kind of academic conversation where people sort of said, yes, thank you. You've named something that we were seeing as well. And now we have a term that we can use. So basically, I would say that the history of it is sort of people became aware of postmodernism. They became aware then also in time that it was sort of declining and done. People were aware then that something would come after. People tried to name it. Arguably didn't succeed very well in sort of identifying the core trends and the core patterns until these metamodern thinkers in 2010. And the past 13 years have really been seeing that discourse really explode and then flower into a number of different sort of strands. And this book is really trying to bring them all together and see the deeper structure with that. So I could go on and on about this sort of stuff. I don't know if this is too much into the weeds and whatnot, but I would say that, it's not a done, settled deal. I mean, someone could publish a book tomorrow, and then, they say, oh, actually, this is what's going on, and maybe that could get traction. One of the interesting things, too, though, I will just note, is just that I think there was a certain kind of exuberance and interest in postmodernism in the academy in like the latter 20th century. And I think people in the academy, at least the American Academy, are sort of, they're kind of over it. And so people have been exploring different things. And so in that context, a lot of American academics especially aren't really asking these kinds of questions. I think that people will be circling back to these periodization questions and asking these sorts of things relatively, I think it's happening already, but I think it'll be happening more and more the further out, we get from postmodernism, and people are still writing textbooks and histories and saying, all right, well, what's this now, right? So I think that in that sort of absence, this literature has sprung up, and I think it's just sort of waiting to be fully integrated into academic discourse more broadly. The last thing I'll say about that, I guess, is just that the academy is still very postmodern. So a lot of people aren't necessarily even interested in the academy of asking what comes after postmodernism. There's a certain kind of commitment to the postmodern paradigm. So in some ways, this is kind of an upset. This is something a little bit radical about this. And, not everyone is happy that postmodernism is, seen as, just old news. So those are a lot of dynamics. I'll try to, let me know if I start going into too much of the weeds here, but this is, they're just interesting things, I think.
Yeah, they
this
are.
Whole thing.
I mean, what I was interested in and still is kind of the fight, not even a fight, but around the term itself. Like, what are we going to call this period? Right. And I would love to hear from you. And I've gone down the rabbit hole to find out some alternative choices that were out there, and they're still permeating, they're still all around there. So if this era were not called metamodernism, what's second place? What would be the next best term in your opinion?
I've always thought the word Reconstruction captured something really significant, like the Reconstructionist, right? And I say that for a number of reasons. One is, deconstruction is a huge element of kind of the postmodern paradigm. And what all these metamodern articulations have in common is the next step, which is, after you deconstruct, you reconstruct. And there's a positive, productive, generative mode to all of these articulations of metamodernism. And so this theme of Reconstruction recurs a lot. I had the idea independently, and then I read some metamodern books, and then they're using the word. And so, but I could also see why that wouldn't work so well. There's a whole Reconstructionist era in American history, which has a specific political, historical term. So, but in terms of if we are speaking of eras, right, kind of the way you talk about the Romantic era or something, I'd say that there's something like a Reconstructionist era in the arts.
Interesting.
But I was actually personally, I wrestled with the term metamodernism. To me, at first, it sounded very kind of clunky, very pretentious. It was at least better than post-postmodernism, but it was still sort of. But it was like, oh, meta. Oh, it's so meta. There's there's a kind of element to that. I was a little bit surprised that it took off. But for me, it's not about how pretty the word is. It's like, what can we use it for? What can we do with it? And once you sort of have this term and people are aware that there's this thing going on, it's been incredibly productive. So we can call it whatever we want.
Sure. I think metamodernism is the best term I've heard. The next best one, but it doesn't fit as nicely, but there is something that resonates, is performatism.
Yes.
That is one that I kind of hear and I get, and it's sort of an active daily kind of a sense and a feeling, but it's so external and social and persona laden that I don't think it encompasses enough. I think metamodern does better, but.
Yeah, so performatism, there's a book by Raoul Eshelman, who's a cultural theorist who wrote this, and it was sort of a precursor to a lot of the metamodern art analysis. He has a chapter in the anthology by Vermeulen and van Daniker, who are those Dutch cultural theorist. I've interviewed him. I think his work is very good. One thing I do think that metamodernism has going for it is that I think it helps situate very clearly what kind. You asked, what is metamodernism? It's like, well, what kind of a thing is it? Well, it's like it's the sort of thing when we say something is modern and we say something's postmodern. Now there's a sort of thing that we can say is metamodern,
Right.
and I think that term having that kind of modern post meta is a nice kind of it makes that connection clear.
I agree. Yeah.
And so there's an element there to that.
It's a good through line for sure to keep the term, because I was wondering, like, why not? Was there consideration for leaving the term behind and just starting afresh, starting anew? But then the through line is lost, and perhaps you can't gain traction that way. So I do have a couple things about metamodernism that I'm not sure you call them critiques, but just kind of questions. And I'm sure these are not original. I'm sure you've thought about these. But are you familiar with the acronym W.E.I.R.D? W-E-I-R-D. It's for those listening, it's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. It's oftentimes used as a critique for psych research, psychology research on college campuses. The kinds of people that a lot of psych research looks at are people in that demographic, in the weird demographic. And it's hard to extrapolate findings for that subset of group to say everybody. And that's what ends up happening a lot of the time. So do you feel that, these studies, cultural studies in general, I mean, going back to, postmodernism, modernism, now metamodernism, do you feel like it falls into that trap at all?
I think some framings do. I think that there are more sophisticated framings that are aware of that and then try to account for that in the theory. So one of the things I think it's a great question because it does help clarify something, right? One of the big fault lines, let's say, along some of these discourses is that some people talk about metamodernism as a period, the same way we talk about the Romantic period. And that which has specific sort of chronological duration sort of markers, right? And other people talk about it as, let's just say, something else. And the issue there, right, is that when you're talking about cultural periods, those are very hard to theorize successfully, right? I mean, even if you want to talk about the Romantic period, then it's like, okay. And then you'll see in a textbook, well, it's somewhere, like the end of the 18th century and, into the 19th century. And maybe we equate it to something like the long 19th century or something like that. Whatever. And then you can get these sub periods and you can write and the Sturm und Drang and all this stuff, right? But then it's like, okay, what are we really talking about? What was going on in Australia at this time? What about, Bulgaria or whatever, right? It doesn't really work like that. So you have to start narrowing. Then you're like, okay, well, this is more in this area during this time. And then you're like, So anyway, long story short, these sorts of periodization approaches are really problematic. And this was a view that I changed on. I was more in the period camp when I first discovered metamodernism because I thought it was helpful. And then I became aware of these other ways of talking about metamodernism that basically say, no, that's too problematic to frame it that way. And I've since kind of come to adopt that perspective, which is something like this. And this gets to the term cultural logic, right? So, which is the subtitle of the book, The Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics. Very meta. So what is a cultural logic, right, would be sort of the question then.
Yeah.
And it's not just, it's not a period. It's not like, there's a certain century and we see certain stuff in certain places and therefore, like, what does that mean? Like I can find patterns all over the place, and there's a deeper question there that I think periodization schemas are missing. So then you have to get into the structure, which is really what a word like logic is suggesting. There's a cultural logic. And then you start getting into different ways of framing these sorts of approaches. That is really where the deeper theory becomes important. The cultural theory that you're working with is significant. And here's where some of these divides emerge in the metamodern discourse. So what you're getting at is that, that the context is very important. And let's say you're talking about, contexts that you're going to be working with certain kinds of institutional structures. You're going to be working with certain economic structures. You're going to be working with certain psychological mimetic structures. These are, let's just say, this is another way of thinking about how this works, and I find it more compelling. So I talked about reflection earlier, and I think that we can kind of use this as a way into resolving this, right? Which is sort of, there are varying degrees of reflection and how reflective one is being about something, right? And there are conditions that allow that reflection, that, let's say, support that kind of reflection, and then there are conditions that, either hinder it or it's just not important or what have you, right? So if you're in a context, like let's say you are in an academic context in a master's program or an advanced degree program studying culture, right? That's a context that has a lot of incentive to reflecting on culture and theorizing and trying to bring all this stuff, into your reality. If you're like, I grew up in a small town, and you're I don't know, you're not engaging with like this literature about thinking about culture. You're work on a farm, or you're just not, it's not, these things don't relate. They're not important. They're not means of, they're not elements for objects of analysis. Like, and why should they be? They're sort of just irrelevant, essentially. And so it is contextual of like, when are these things actually significant, sort of, objects of analysis, and what's sort of the incentive structure for creating layers upon layers of reflection. Now, one of the things I do mention in the book, though, is that as culture does sort of become more reflective, it does make it kind of increasingly inescapable that you're going to bump up against these objects of study. So, for example, one of the issues I bring up in the book, right, is that like right now there's a big conversation around gender identity, and a lot of this discourse comes from ideas that emerged in kind of social constructive thought that comes out of sociology, deconstructing gender norms and this sort of language, which comes out of the academy, essentially, right? But here we are in 2023, and the summer blockbuster movie is Barbie, and it's a movie about patriarchy. It's a movie about these rather kind of, it's a very reflective, self-aware, meta kind of movie that is... It's weird because it's like, this is supposed to be this pop culture thing. So what you're seeing is this infusion of pop culture with these rather abstract, theoretical, ivory tower sorts of notions that they're sort of seeping into the culture and becoming the stuff of cultural production itself. So on the other hand, there really is this permeation of society with like highly reflective ideas. Now, at the same time, you're going to be getting a different thing watching the Barbie movie than if you go read like Judith Butler or something, right? So there are layers in terms of understanding what we're really getting at when we're dealing with these, let's say, reflective concepts in culture. So anyway, that might be getting really, a little too fine grained, but the point to that you're getting at is really important, which is just that it's really simplistic to say, oh, now that it's the 21st century, we live in a metamodern era. That's just not true everywhere, right? It's sort of like there are two quotes in particular. One is Adorno said about modernity. He said that modernity is a qualitative, not a chronological category. Right, which is not about the time that someone lives in. It's about this qualitative set of ideas. This is why it's a worldview. It's a cultural logic, and all those things are going to be mediated through institutional contexts and cultural contexts and ideas, etc., that are prevalent in certain places and not others. And then the other quote is something, I forget who said it, but they were talking about the future, but Jason Storm, the metamodern philosopher, relates it to metamodernism, where he says, if metamodernism is here, it's not evenly distributed. Just to say that this isn't, the sorts of ideas that he's grappling in his book about, if you go to, just anywhere, you're not going to find these things, right? So, these things then do become interesting to try to unpack, and I have trouble doing this sometimes in the most they become rather sensitive issues too, because some of this also relates to power and privilege, and there's a notion of if you get an advanced level degree, well then yes, maybe you have a very reflective take on this very complex issue, but that's also a product of privilege, right? That you're able to do that, and so there are issues around, let's say, the resources that go into flowing into institutional contexts and economic contexts that have sociological implications for who is gaining access to this level of privileged education and reflection, that sort of a thing. But this is the same thing that you find with postmodernism too, right? I mean, it's largely a product of the ivory tower, and one of the critiques of postmodernism was that, ironically, a lot of what the postmodern theorists were describing about the world, well, that didn't apply to, let's say, underprivileged areas, right? Where people aren't having these kinds of conversations. These aren't the things that matter to people. It's this sort of top-down imposition of ideas. So the point, broadly speaking, is that these things are tied up in resources, privilege, power, history, etc. And that's maybe a very long explanation for that.
Well, I want to go back to that, but quick sidebar: what did you think of the Barbie movie?
I thought it was. I mean, on the whole, I liked it. I guess I thought it was a little bit of a mishmash, right? I mean, it was sort of like. And then you can kind of ask, is it supposed to be a mishmash, right? Because part of you is always wanting it to land. At least I was. It was sort of like, okay, so what are you really saying? And then it would say something, and then the next scene would sort of undercut what it had just said. It was sort of so playful and yet so self-aware simultaneously that I didn't really take away the sense of here's the message. But then maybe that is the message, right? So it was kind of hard to come to a a full-on conclusion about it, but that might have been by design. And but I thought it was a sort of a touchstone for a certain cultural moment that we're in right now. I think it's said a lot, so it's a fascinating sort of cultural artifact of where our culture is.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree. It's an interesting cultural artifact. I was disappointed, if I got to be honest. I did not love it. And I love Greta Gerwig, the director. Huge fan of, loved Lady Bird, loved Little Women. I think she's fantastic. I think she's wonderful, but I was let down.
But see, this is what's so funny too, right? Is you were let down by the Barbie movie. Because what standard did we have for the Barbie movie? That's what's so interesting about it, right?
The hype train might have been just too high, but I don't get, why did the Kens get to have all the fun?
So it speaks to a lot of the confusion at the moment too, right? And it's how, on the one hand, it's dealing with all these polarizing issues, but I think on the whole, it sort of avoided enough landmines that it could be broadly enjoyed. There was sort of enough for everyone of everything, but So anyway, in the context of this conversation, I would say that there is something sort of proto-metamodern about it, but it doesn't really kind of rise into that domain. It was still kind of ultimately a kind of postmodern pastiche of ideas. But there were these little moments that were like, oh, that made me feel something.
No, don't get me wrong. I thought there were moments that were great, but alas, I'll have to do a video review of Barbie at some point. But I had no problem with the messaging or anything like that. I just mean it as a piece of entertainment. But I do want to. So let's just go back a little bit to what I was talking about, the that W.E.I.R.D acronym a little bit here. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but modernism, the study of modernism, postmodernism has been mostly viewed through a Western lens. Is that more or less accurate? Would you say that's a more or less Western concept?
Okay, so part of the reason why this is difficult to talk about is because I want to do justice to all the framings of metamodernism, if I can. And at the same time, to answer this question the way that I think is the best, I have to sort of take a side, which is with a particular form of metamodern discourse. So I'll just say that up front so that people watching this are not taking what I'm saying as being representative of all metamodern ways of thinking. But what I would say is, so there is a strand in the metamodern discourse that talks a lot in terms of development and complexification. And actually some of this might kind of be, where we start to dovetail with a lot of the content that you get into on this channel with complexity and whatnot. But if you think about social complexification, and gosh, there's a lot. I mean, I'm writing a book on this at the moment, so I'll try to be
wow.
concise about it. But
on to the next one already.
Yeah, well, this one's the big one. I was actually working on the other book, and then I stopped to write this one because it needed to kind of be out there. But now I'm back to the other one. So all right, let's look at it this way. This will be interesting, right?
Sure.
And okay, so you're familiar with dissipative structures, right? I think you've talked about on your channel. Okay. So you've got these far from equilibrium systems that need to extract energy in order to maintain their informational integrity and persist, basically. And then you can chart this sort of developmental process by means of which this basic sort of process creates more and more complex dissipative systems. There is dissipative adaptation, and you get life and these sorts of things. So we are dissipative systems. In order to maintain myself, I need to bring in energy and all this stuff, right? And you wind up getting these increasingly complex entities, organisms. Now, you can look at society as a kind of superorganism, and this isn't any radical new way of thinking. A number of people look at it this way, right? You can look at cities like this, and you can look at broader kind of Bobby Azarian in the end of his book, which I mention in my book, is talks about worldviews as operating this way. That basically you have a collection of individuals, in this case individual people, that are all part of this sort of collective superorganism. Now this broader superorganism is made up of these things, but it's also sort of like, it's not fully reducible to it either. And you can think of it as sort of like increasing in relative complexity. So that just as, like a living cell is more complex than a whirlpool, right? But they're both dissipative systems. Like the informational structure, just the informational complexity of a cell is just, much greater than this other simpler system, basically using the same, mechanisms to sustain itself, right? But then this process continues. If you think about the superorganism of a social organization and the complexification going on at that level, then you can look at this process that I'm describing of this cultural evolutionary process as being a version of this recursive reflection, is bringing in more information into the system, so to speak, right? So basically through recursive reflection, you're getting, oh, okay, I was looking at that, but now I can take that as an object. Now I can decenter from that and see more and more and more. You're getting more complex. You're getting more informationally rich. And so arguably, these different worldview perspectives are doing something like that. They're getting more information coming into their system, so that if I'm able to reflect on, let's just say art, right? That's going to be one level of kind of informational complexity. But now if I'm able to reflect on the act of reflecting on art, now there's even more, right? And if this process iteratively builds on itself, then you're going to have increasing informational complexity. Now you're also going to have an increased demand for energy input in order to maintain that informational complexity. So then you've really got to start thinking about the material embodied reality of this. And this is what basically social structures existing in, socio-political, economic, geographical contexts are doing. They're taking in energy, they're processing information, they're exporting waste, they're maintaining their basic integrity, and they're adding complexity as well. So this is a developmental process that unfolds, and you need more energy, and you need more complexity to engage in this sort of evolutionary process, this cultural evolutionary process. So once you start thinking of the shift of worldviews in these terms, you can start to understand how and why those different contexts will exist. So, for example, if you look at a river system, right? And you get the kind of Adrian Behan sort of, one to many, that whole kind of, what does he call the flow dynamics, right? You have this sort of meta pattern that you see all over. You see it in cosmic filaments, you see it in river systems, you see it in artery, patterns. It's flow. It's how it looks. Yeah. And what we find with flow is that it's basically, you get these sort of where they consolidate these nodes, you get basically structure. You get complexity, right? So like it's at the mouth of the river that spreads out that you get the big city, and all roads lead to Rome, and you get this sort of growing informational complexity and informational richness happening at these sort of these areas where everything kind of converges of like a web, basically, right? Or you can think about the cosmic filaments, like our galaxy exists in a galaxy cluster that in one of these sort of nodes in the cosmic filament, and there's sort of something going on with I'm not a physicist, so I can't explain all the details, but there's something flowing through these broad structures that sort of culminates. And the simplest way of thinking, right, is like go to a desert, look at the Nile, right? It's along the banks of the river that you see all this growth and fecundity and vitality, right, and all the dissipative structures that are emerging to harness energy from their environment to kind of create complexity. And then you go, a few kilometers away into the desert, and it's nothing. So anyway, if there are these flow patterns that exist that are sort of channeling energy, in various forms, let's say, you can look at cultural evolution as being part of that sort of broad meta pattern. And so one way of looking at, books like Blood, Germs, and Steel, what's it called? Germs.
Germs, Blood, and Steel. Yeah, I know it's Jared
Blood,
Diamond,
Germs, and
think.
Steel. Yeah, the Jared Diamond book.
Yeah.
He gets into some of this stuff in terms of like the distributional channels and like the axes in which these continents are laid out and stuff like this. Some interesting theories, right? But you can start to see these flow patterns in terms of the distribution of energy into systems that complexifies them. Now, this isn't a case for, this is fully natural and, moral or good or something, right? You can have imperialist structures that go into places and extract their raw resources and then funnel them to their capital cities, right? But the basic kind of thermodynamic process, if you want to talk about it that way, is still at work, which is that there's these super organism systems that are extracting energy from their environment to increase the informational complexity going on. And if you look at that from a cultural evolutionary standpoint, you can understand why there will be certain nodes that are disproportionately complexified compared to others. You get an uneven distribution of complexification. And again, I want to be clear. I don't want to say that that's inherently good or whatever or natural. Sure, yeah. I don't want to. This isn't like a naturalistic fallacy sort of thing. I'm not trying to say this is we should all just buy this because we need to interrogate what the deeper structural causes are. But that does seem to be the process. So when we talk about W.E.I.R.D, I think a lot of what we're talking about there is something like that, which is not just histories of colonialism and oppression and that sort of thing, which is what the postmodernists want to frame it as. But it's also not, just great civilizations due to, you name it, our blood or our religion or whatever, which is more kind of modern or even pre-modern way of thinking about trying to explain some of these, uneven distributions. But there are complex socio-political, economic reasons why these resource channels, flow channels, get set up in the way that they do. And my broad point would be that where you find the greatest convergence of this kind of energy flowing into a particular node, you're going to find this kind of greater complexification there. And so I think that there are certain sort of centers or hubs that are particularly complex. I mean, like a university system in a town is going to be something like that, right? Like there's going to be something, and these are, but they're socio-political instantiations of these deeper processes. That would be the claim. So that would be an idea that could be put out there. But the broader issue is something like this complexification process does require energy and resources in this way, and so you're going to find, like, if metamodernism represents a particularly complex perspective, maybe a more complex perspective than postmodernism, which is more complex than modernism, et cetera, then expect to find it at these nodes of sort of, informational energy confluences, essentially, which, are going to be major metropolitan areas, and they're going to be the products of education systems and art and, privilege, essentially, which is able to leverage these resources. So anyway, I'm trying to unpack a lot of stuff here because this to answer that question requires, in some ways, grappling with all the postmodern critique and integrating its insights, right? But it also requires not just settling, right? A postmodern answer would be, oh, well, because, rich white people took all the power from other people. And so, like it's just rich white people who are talking about metamodernism, and that's all that, and it only matters to them. Right. But like there's some truth in that. But there's also a lot more going on than just that that's related to these broader patterns. So I think that one of the things that metamodernism would even try to do in understanding metamodernism itself is trying to bring in frameworks of complexity, frameworks of information theory and this sort of stuff to understand social evolution, cultural evolution in a way that actually is able to integrate even the earlier cultural logics framings of these issues. That's a whole lot of stuff. I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that, but
I do. I have a ton of thoughts about it. I'm so interested that you went in that direction of, but I still can't shake the thought that, like, I don't see, and I haven't seen yet, but I'm also not a scholar here, an integration with Eastern modes of thought, with things that are outside the West, and now that would be a divergence from what I know to be a modernist and postmodernist scholarship. So that would be a new thing, I think, to take in and bring in. But I might be wrong about that, obviously. So
one of the interesting things that you see in the latter 20th century, especially, are these alternative modernisms, basically, as they're talked about in the academy, right? So, modernism, let's just say, like prototypical modernism, as people were talking about it in the academy, shows up in Europe. And so that's sort of the first kind of instance of this thing.
Yeah.
But then what happens, right, and there are socio-political economic reasons for that at that time, right?
Yeah.
So you have to get into the whole geopolitical situation and all that. But that arguably is, I would try to make the case, because Europe at that moment was the center in which, all these resources and energy was flowing into it and kind of fueling complexification. I mean, if you look at the end of the 19th century, you do have these imperial places, centers of power that are, doing colonialist redistributions of wealth into the main, all the stuff that postmodern critics critique about when they say, gosh, look at just this rape of resources that happens under imperialism. Like, that's true, right? But the kind of thermodynamic consequence of that is you have this influx of all these resources into Europe as a power base at that period. So it makes sense that you see, this cultural period of development and complexification. Just as, for example, and there's something specific about Europe, you go back in time, you see the same thing happening in the Ottoman Empire. Just before the Renaissance, Europe was a total backwater, and you had these incredible flowering civilizations. The Mughal Empire, so this is a broad kind of pan-human phenomenon. It's sort of what are the specific factors at any given moment that lead to the rise of a particular civilization and its ability to basically take in energy from its environment and complexify relative to others. But at the moment that modernism shows up, that is happening in Europe. Now, fast forward 50 years, and let's say, first of all, after the world wars and all that, but also after the export of this new kind of industrialization and this new kind of capitalist, that the export of capitalism, basically, that the West does throughout the world, and you see basically alternative modernism showing up in other parts of the world. So Latin America goes through this modernization period, and you get basically modernist art coming out of Latin America, in the 1950s, 1960s. The author who I think won the Nobel Prize for was it 100 Years of Solitude, and basically you get this flowering of modernist art, and arguably, I mean, the point would be, you're seeing the same process that basically unfolded in Europe in the latter 19th century and the early 20th century now being exported and happening in other places. And a lot of this is coming through industrialization and basically the just exponential increase in the ability to extract free energy from the environment, to complexify the social organism. So I guess the point is, these other modernisms do exist. You see the same thing in Japan, for example, or Singapore, right? I mean, like, if there's a case study for hypermodernism, it would be some of these places, especially Singapore, right? So So modernism isn't like a thing that just the weird white Europeans do.
Right.
Modernism, I think there's a deeper structural angle there, which mostly through like dialectical materialism tends to be explained through economic forces, right? So like Marx was all over this stuff already anyway in his own way, and the Marxist theorists who came after were doing similar stuff, basically saying we've got to look at economics as sort of the base and then look at culture as the superstructure. Now that's too simplistic and it's too reductionistic. I would say something that these more in line with some of these metamodern thinkers, which is taking a cue from, say, Habermas, who's like, we can't just look at those economic structures. We have to look at the way that individual human minds relate to their cultural environments and other people around them using certain kinds of rational problem-solving, discourse, communicative action, which is a developmental process, which means that when we talk about development, broadly speaking, there's a whole other psychological, psychomimetic aspect to these dynamics that we're describing. It's not just, hey, look, now a new factory shows up in a city, and then all of a sudden there's all these new jobs, there's this influx of people, you get economic growth, and then you get a certain kind of culture. You also have to go deeper than that and say, why did a factory show up there? And like, what skills are needed to run the factory? And what sort of institutions need to exist? And ideals and values do people need to at least nominally hold in certain economic and political structures to be able to permit this thing to happen? So there's a deeper level of analysis. So then you get these metamodern thinkers like Hanzi Freinacht who really go to the core, which is like human psychological complexification, which is the model of hierarchical complexity and associated neo-Piagetian models of human development. So long story short, this is a whole nother level to this where you can marry this thermodynamic complexification process to the kind of cognitive complexification process into the human psychological and sociological complexification process to explain why you get certain cultural logics appearing where they do. And then that's where ideas like Bobby Azarian's and Greg Enriquez's come in handy to think about this complexification process and how it unfolds. But that's a lot. That's a lot I'm throwing out there. But that would be my attempt to answer this issue, which is dealt with maybe a lot simpler by other people. But at the same time, if you're going to really get into the complex nature of these issues, it's going to have to be a complex answer that we're dealing with. A lot of the problems with these more simplistic postmodern approaches is that they leave out half the story, and then you just kind of get these dynamics of, oh, there are evil people in the world who take other people's stuff, and then that's it. It's just power. And it's right. Well, they're not wrong. It is power, but you have to conceive power more broadly. You have to conceive power in terms of energy as well, and then you also have to seriously factor in how do social norms and values actually shift through the infusion of power, which is a very interesting question in its own right. So anyway, I could go on and on. I hope this is making sense to your audience, but it's an important issue.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I think you've touched on just a number of interesting nuggets, and I hope people go down the rabbit holes of many things that you just mentioned. The other thing I want to cover off on one more thing on metamodernism before diving a little bit more into your book, and I have specific things about the book that I want to dive into, specific passages, specific topics, things that touched me. And the first is, but before we get there, about metamodernism, and it's something that I've heard that it's instead of a balance between modernism, modern thought, and postmodern thought, it's an oscillation. And it's a sort of a pendulum swinging around. And I think you had a video, you have to tell me which one it was specifically on your channel, which I'll link below in the description for people to check out your YouTube channel, of the floating LED message clock, that toggles back and forth and is moving all the time. I thought that was a wonderful visual. But could you help us understand, the audience, and myself too, why an oscillation, a pendulum, instead of, say, staying in one spot and just being a balance between opposing forces?
Yeah, so the oscillation idea is the one that gets put forward by Vermeulen and von Daniker in trying to explain what they're seeing in culture, circa 2010. And they're trying to say, oh, we see this sensibility And it's this oscillation back and forth between these typically modern, idealistic and naive and sort of utopian aspirationalist perspectives. And then it oscillates to this more cynical, postmodern, kind of reflective, hyper-reflective, self-aware perspective. And this was the dynamic that they were naming. That was helpful, but it's a little unfortunate. It was helpful for getting this idea of metamodernism out into the discourse, but I think that the oscillation idea is one of the maybe weaker notions of this whole thing. So personally, I don't much subscribe to emphasizing it. Even people in the cultural studies who very much are just doing the cultural studies, metamodernism, kind of critique it or try to, Raoul Echelon critiques it. Greg Dember says it's not just that, it's other stuff. So I think oscillation's overrated.
Okay,
but I think,
that's great.
I think,
Hot take.
The last thing I'll say is I think that it was framed that way, for genuine intellectual purposes. I think that they were seeing something going on there that's important, and I can come back to that. But I also think that the nature of the academy in being particularly postmodern is to eschew grand narratives and let's say Hegelian sorts of framings of things. So there's kind of an allergy I interpret to looking at things in terms of a Hegelian, because that would mean that there's some profound thing going on in the world that's more than just, basically power politics or structures of capitalism, right? And so you can really dig into that and say, when I read these conversations about oscillation, I see them very much as sort of like, we're trying to talk about dialectics here, but we aren't going to talk about dialectics. We're going to say that there's this oscillation. There's a dialectical oscillation. And then people are just like, come on, man, just call it dialectics. That's what it basically is. It's just so much, So anyway, that's my basic take on that. So
Oh, interesting. Okay, so you don't care as much about the oscillation of the pendulum swinging kind of balance.
No, because I think there's a better way of talking about it. So I introduced the term toggling in the book.
Right,
Right, so oscillation, almost by definition, is there's two things and you're going back and forth. So there's two nodes. But even in 2010, those Dutch cultural theorists introducing metamodernism said, but let's be careful that it's not two nodes. It's actually many nodes. It's 1, 2, 3, 5, 10.
Right.
And it's like, well, then why are we calling it oscillation? So there's that element. I prefer toggling because the idea that I'm getting at through recursive reflection is that once you're aware of a particular perspective, you can toggle into it. You can see that that's a particular mode or sensibility that exists, and you can inhabit it, right? I can pick up my glasses and I can put them on, but I can also take them off. So I can toggle into different perspectives through different lenses. And I wouldn't say that I oscillate into different lenses or I oscillate into different glasses that I wear. I'd say, I'm moving between perspectives. So the more you're able to reflect on these cultural logics, the more you're able to actually then toggle in and out of them as needed. And I think that was the genuine kernel of insight that those Dutch scholars were naming when they were talking about oscillation, which is 1 second you're kind of doing a postmodern thing, but then you kind of do this modern thing, right? And it's not really a balance of either. It's like either or, but but because it's both of them, it's not either or. It's both and, but then it's either or and both and or neither. So the point is that these things are existing kind of in a back and forth way. Not as sort of like we've transcended this and now we've integrated it and now it's a perfect sort of new equilibrium. I think they were trying to emphasize the dynamic nature of it, and I think it's important to do that. But I don't think it's all that important as a framing, personally.
Yeah, that's great to know. Okay, that's really helpful context. Yeah, because I'm thinking about it now, and sincere irony is a phrase a lot of people use for metamodernism, and if it was an oscillation or a pendulum, let's say, in 1 minute someone was sincere, and then the next they were ironic, and then they were sincere, and then ironic, and then sincere, that would drive me bananas. I would hate that person who wants to be with someone who is just changing left and right. It would just be weird, and you wouldn't want it. But someone who can be sincere most of the, or a lot of the time, and then occasionally can give you a winking kind of a nod to, a reflective kind reflective about their sincerity sometimes, that's a good thing. It's a good balance to have.
Yeah, I think also naming the different dynamics, and then considering the possible ways that they can, all the kind of permutations of it, right? So like I talk about Bo Burnham's Inside in the book.
Yes.
And that's a great example, I think, of the metamodern sensibility. And he does a bunch of these different things, On the one hand, he'll have this really, just like earnest, vulnerable scene of him just sort of like, struggling. And then it'll pop to the next scene and he'll be doing this song and dance. So there is sort of this back and forth. At the same time, he'll use a song and dance kind of ironic gesture to get at some really serious things,
right.
So there are different ways that these modalities can kind of coexist. And at a certain point, it just becomes highfalutin metamodern theorization of like how, what's going on here and parsing the differences and stuff. But I think if people are interested in metamodernism, it's just the basic idea is that there's this plethora of modalities in the cultural logics available, and how are they being, toggled between, how are they being superimposed, how are they being how is someone just kind of letting go all of this hyper reflection and just being totally sincere and vulnerable. There's all these different ways that now that this can happen, and so that's kind of the more important part.
So we got your thoughts on Barbie. What's your review of Bo Burnham's Inside?
I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was absolute genius. Yeah.
Okay, great.
I guess I would say, there are moments in it that kind of veer more towards sort of just classic pomo cynicism. There's a sketch he does with Saki, and he's like, this is the way the world works. And here he's just being, ironic and cynical. And he's like talking about, the power, systems in the world and all this stuff. And then you watch that and you're like, oh, that's just brutal and caustic. I mean, it's incisive, but it's also, you don't walk away from that being, and then there are these other moments that I think are genuinely, kind of, they transcend that, and they're somehow able to bring that cynicism in, and yet you get this, I don't know, this whole other level that's simultaneously like deeply vulnerable and real and sincere and earnest. And yet you don't feel like it's cringy. You feel like it's the product of this profound reflection, even while it's not being reflective. So, I think it's a masterpiece.
Wow, that's great. And you do it. It's in the book, and you also have a YouTube video where you deconstruct his the reaction video sketch, which was the most, because I saw it a year or two ago, and that was the most lasting sketch for me. When I saw it, I was like, oh wow, that was brilliant. And as you put it, it starts off very silly, and then as he gets level deeper, he starts to reveal some particular truths. The one that was most salient to me was at the very end. I think he says something to the degree that self-awareness doesn't absolve you of anything, which I think is true, which I think is accurate actually, and is but it took him a few steps to get. I mean, that's part of the comedy of the sketch.
I think it also, I mean, Bo Burnham clearly is a sort of person who is like, who grapples with a certain kind of crippling self-reflection. I mean, that's something he's kind of, said about himself, that it's a framing for that particular work, is that he's like dealt with this, crippling anxiety attacks on being on stage, is just so self-aware. And so I think that that's also something that should be brought into this conversation, that like, when you get this iterative recursive self-reflection, the point isn't that it always creates this sort of, I don't know, it's not like, everything's better the more reflective you get, necessarily. It can also be sort of an issue, right? But I think that how would I put it? It's important to view that dynamic as the dynamic in which a lot of metamodern cultural production, springs from, that is happening within. And that's very different, from less reflective modalities and ways of being in the world. When you live in as I did in when I was younger, a very kind of absolutistic religious framework that's like, oh no, those people are bad and we're good, and here's the story and this will happen. And then you're not really yet even reflective of the lens that you're viewing the world through, right? And then when people, it's not coincidental, deconstruct that kind of absolutistic framework, and they can see, oh, I used to think this way. And now they're able to reflect on that, take it and compare it to how they think now, right? And so if you keep doing this thing, this creates problems. It creates issues for meaning. It becomes harder to just sort of naively, affirm things because you're constantly having to weigh all these other aspects. I mean, it can be difficult to try to weigh all of the complexity of the world and to deal with that in a way that is graceful. Without just stumbling over yourself and tripping over all the ways of seeing the world that are possible. Kierkegaard is another figure I think that is sort of emblematic of this sort of a thing. So there's a kind of curse too to self-reflection, and I guess I just wanted to name that. And it's symptomatic also of a certain kind of social situation that certain people find themselves in. That if you're out hunting the plains for food, you're not going to have these kinds of issues about just obsessing over a particular the death of the author or something. You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
So there's something about that.
Yeah, that's why I wonder about, because I want to return to this this one line that's in your book a few times, this recursive transcendence through iterative self-reflection. And because, it does seem like potentially a curse sometimes to, like, when do you know when to stop self-reflecting? When do you have this idea, like with Burnham, in his case, it can go sort of too far. So you need something to counteract that, to balance that out. So that's why I was really top of mind of something we talked about a few minutes ago, was around, because this idea of the selfhood, if we had to do a dichotomous thing between West and East, some Eastern traditions might say poke holes at the idea of a self or the idea of an ego, right? And lean more towards the idea that these things are illusions. And I'm not saying that that's useful or better in any regard, but I do think I'm reminded too of something that's sticking out to me too right now about, and this is going to be a little fuzzy, but something to the degree that when, I can't remember who said this or what podcast it was, but in general terms, like in America, when you're feeling depressed, when you're feeling bad, most people, what ends up happening, you get in this spiral within the self. You go inward. I can speak to personal experience as well. With when I've had depressive periods, that's sort of what ended up happening.
Reciprocal narrowing.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly. And yet in other parts of the world, not necessarily just in the East, but in some other places, the mindset is when you are feeling depressive or lack of meaning, you look outward instead of looking inward. And you say, where can I help? What else can I do? Let me go out of myself. And in personal experience, when I've, done that in my life and I've looked outward and I've sought more connection and trying to get out of my head, it's been very helpful. And I can understand, and I know that's not like a clear thing. You do have to put your oxygen mask on first before you can help other people. But does that resonate? Do you think about that at all? I mean, that's sort of this balance, and I don't want to just only critique this idea of self-reflection, but if it does reach a point where it's not useful, or that you need to strike a fine balance, like maybe there's an outward-looking perspective that's more helpful.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on there. A couple things. I mean, one of the things that's worth kind of emphasizing or mentioning, at least, is that self-reflection. And then the question is, well, what do you mean by the self? And if we're talking about cultural shifts and trends, from like modernism to postmodernism and so on, then the thing being reflected upon isn't necessarily the individual, it's the individual cultural context. It's the individual cultural milieu, which the individual is sort of an instantiation of or representative of in a particular way. So in that sense, it is also individual. But and there are going to be correlations then between, people who both the level of reflection that occurs both at the cultural and the individual level. I mean, if you're able to take all these things into account, then you're going to probably apply it both to self and to cultural context and situate yourself in the context and all that. So anyway, I just wanted to draw that distinction that I think is important. And so there's that. And then in terms of this, turning in, turning out, I don't know if I'm in a position to say anything intelligent on that topic, in the sense of, broadly speaking, yes, there are definitely differences in, what we tend to, talk about as like the Western ego and then Eastern conceptions of the self. I think that's a very fascinating topic, but I think the level of granularity you would need to get into why there are those differences and what's going on and all that would take us too far afield of the present topic. So I don't want to try to say too much on that. But I guess I will just say that I think you ask a critical question, which is, when is there too much reflection? And I think that one of the things that metamodernism signals is the realization of how to answer those questions. I think that postmodernism largely is what gets stuck in over reflection. And so what you see with metamodernism is not necessarily the abandonment of reflection, but it's a redirection of it towards, positive reconstructive ends, at least. And it's also the level of reflection at which you can become aware that reflection is no longer serving you. So in that Burnham sketch, right, the end of it, he says, I'm going to stop this. I don't like looking at myself this way. I'm going to stop this. I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop. And then he stops it and he looks at the camera and he smiles. And so, I think that there's an interesting way in which the renewal of sort of sincerity and innocence in metamodern art reflects that shift of people being like, yeah, I know I can keep reflecting, but I also just, damn it, really like dachshunds. I love dachshunds, and I'm going to be cringy about it, and that's okay, because otherwise I could just keep reflecting on it, or what, So there's this, you get this sense of this new simplicity and this earnestness and this vulnerability that's not coming out from an earlier, less reflective stance. It's coming as the consequence of reflection. That's like, okay, I'm so reflective that I know I just need to stop reflecting. And I think that you don't find that as much in a postmodern context. It seems like it's, if you stop reflecting, then you kind of give in, and then you're a sucker. And as long as you can be cynical, you can show that you understand and all this. So there's a reticence towards that in the postmodern sensibility. But the metamodern sensibility is like, here's my cringe as well, and we can do this. You look at the films of like Wes Anderson. I think does a really great, is a great example of this, like Moonrise Kingdom, and this sort of very saccharine kind of innocence that shows up. Or some Michel Gondry films. There's just this like emphasis on childhood and playfulness and simplicity. And I think that that's just sort of like there's an element of that abandonment, of the allowance of the abandonment of reflection, which another way of thinking about it would be you can just, when to toggle to a less reflective stance, and that's, I could,
know thyself and have that awareness. I agree with you. Now I'd love to dive into the book specifically a bit more. not that you haven't mentioned the book, or stuff hasn't woven in and out.
Sure.
But I do want to ask you, you kind of mentioned this maybe a little bit at the beginning, but what specifically motivated you to write this book?
Specifically, I was finding that these different camps in the metamodern conversation had kind of emerged, and some of the camps just were like, no, this is real metamodernism, and what you're talking about is just some fake thing. And I was like, well, that's not quite right, because like they're saying all these things, and there's a lot of confluence here. So that broadly speaking, there was sort of a cultural studies camp, which is very much in academia, And then there's this other camp that's sort of more about cultural evolution and complexity and development. And the academic camp was like, no, we're not going to talk about that. That's not how we. This is that's wrong. And just I mean, it was kind of shocking actually. There was like the lack of degree of willingness to kind of see these as being related and meaningfully related and part of a shared discourse. And then you got this philosophical framework from Jason Ananda Josephson Storm that came out, which is brilliant, just absolute brilliant book called Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. And he was willing to engage with all this stuff, but he was doing his own kind of philosophical exploration of working through postmodern philosophy and some of its skepticism and its anti-realism and getting on the other side of that in sort of a dialectical way. So you had at least three camps that when I read these people, I'm like, yeah, you're all talking about very, I don't want to say the same thing, but you're talking about very similar stuff. And you're all using the same word and you're all kind of aware of each other. And so I just thought it's kind of silly. So why not, write something that shows how these are all related? That was one. And then two was this is a discourse about where the cutting edge of culture is, and it's been around for 10 years, at least its earliest forms, and there's no book on it yet that sort of does this, right? So like I don't know, Lyotard had his book on the postmodern condition back in I think it was 76. And then it was only in the 80s, like later 80s, early 90s, where you got David Harvey and Frederick Jameson kind of doing synthetic accounts of postmodernism and, taking into account Ihab Hassan and Charles Jenks and all these postmodern thinkers. And so it's sort of like, well, yeah, we need something like that for metamodernism. And the fact that didn't exist was both like, well, that's an easy thing. I feel like I could do this. I wrote the book in like 4 weeks because I've been in this for a long time. So I'm like, this should exist. And then on top of it,
you wrote this book in 4 weeks. Is that what you just said?
Yeah, because I was working on that other book, and then I'm like, okay, I need to write this book, and then so I wrote the book. Oh my goodness! But so I just felt like it needed to exist because also this is there's no good introduction to it until now. So people were like, "What is metamodernism?" We'd have to have these kinds of conversations on podcasts, and I'm clearly, I would say, not the most succinct, maybe always in a podcast context, and other people are going to be talking about what they think metamodern is. And I just I thought that it was needed to bring all these things together, provide a primer. And the last thing I'll say is that I am uncomfortable with all of the approaches on their own terms as being the totality of what metamodernism is supposed to be, right? So like I love this art aesthetic critique that's coming out of the cultural studies stuff. But I think that their periodization approach is just missing some crucial stuff. I love the Hanzi Freinacht, complexity, Lena Rachel Anderson stuff. But some of it focuses too much on development and this sort of like certain forms of, like personal development stuff. And it's like, no, it's like, so a big goal of the book too was like me trying to take the best out of all these framings and to see, how they are working together in a way that people, if they're not going to say, that Hanzi Freinacht has anything meaningful to say, if they're not going to say that, this person does, they're this person, then maybe they can say, well, Dempsey's metamodernism is a way we can talk about this, which is a way that I think is sort of, so I'm trying to put this also out as sort of like this is also my theory of metamodernism as much as it is a synthesis of these other approaches. And I think that the different camps will be comfortable, I think, with what I say in this book in a way where we can find some common ground there in a way that maybe the Hanzi stuff is too hot to touch from a kind of postmodern academic context, talking about development and progress and stuff. But, I sort of straddle these worlds. So maybe there's a way of framing this stuff that's usable for everyone. So that was basically my intention.
So I want to talk about Hanzi in a moment, because I actually learned about him from your book. I did not know he existed before reading your book. But before we get into him, could you highlight, let's say one, if you could pull out one thing from the book that would be, say, most challenged from the different schools within metamodernism? What do you think would be, say, the most controversial? What do you think has the most degree of disagreement?
I think that I would say this issue of development,
Okay.
and related to that is complexity. So the cultural studies people they don't really go there. They don't talk about it.
Mm.
And there's good reason for that. And there's also ways in which, developmental framings are too problematic or just too simplistic. A lot of the ways sometimes that they get talked about. So one of the things I do try to do in this book is bridge that and make that clearer why and how this can meaningfully be done, right? So like on the one hand, cultural studies people are fine drawing from Marxist critics, like Jameson or Raymond Williams or David Harvey, who talk and even themselves explicitly talk about metamodernism as being the cultural logic of a particular stage of capitalism, which is a very Marxian sort of framing.
Yeah.
But then there's a very easy bridge from like being cool with that to then you just say, all right, but then like Habermas has, reconstructed dialectical materialism in which he takes into account the individual psyche and how it relates to these forces and communicative action. And that's basically what the Hanzi Freinacht books are doing, is sort of using that framework, is bringing in the psychological domain to understand these things. So I think that it doesn't have to be as controversial as it might seem to be. But then again, different audience or different thinkers are aiming at different audiences and trying, and maybe not even caring so much about trying to make these connections for their given audiences. Right. So I'm trying to do some of that work for them. Sure. And then there's this element also in which there's this thing called integral theory, which goes back to this guy named Ken Wilber, and he was a philosopher, and he came up, and there's some great stuff in integral theory, but from an academic context, it's just like it's a no-go. So that's and because there's some overlap and similarities with some of the Hanzi Freinacht stuff talking about human development and integral theory, the academic cultural studies people are like, we can't touch this. And some people feel like, oh, this is just not good if this gets associated with metamodernism because it won't play in the academy and all this stuff.
Sure. Right.
And so that's another kind of fault line. I don't even think I mention integral theory in the book at all. I think it's totally, it's irrelevant for talking about the Hanzi Freinacht work, I think, and the developmental framings of kind of psychomimetic cultural evolution. So I think that's some, and that's, in a weird way, you have to play these, you have to deal with the political aspects of the career aspects of academia and scholarship. And I don't want to see the baby get thrown out with the bathwater. If people feel like, oh, we can't talk about Hanzi Freinacht because then we're going to be implicating Ken Wilber and he's involved. And it's like, no, we don't have to do that. It can stand on its own. And, generally speaking, people are okay with Habermas. And so why not just go back to the root, which is what Ken Wilber was drawing from anyway, and go from that and frame it as a reconstructed dialectical materialism. We're really, for people who don't know much about metamodernism, they're getting the full, they're getting all the details. So yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask you about. I do want to get to Wilber in a bit if you have time, but
sure.
I do want to when we talk about Hanzi Freinacht, and there were a number of moments in the book. I have I've copied and pasted several of your my favorite paragraphs, let's say, from your book, and I had to keep pulling stuff out, and so some wonderful passages there. I will say though, when I got to this moment gave me goosebumps when I was reading it. Well, it was Hanzi Freinacht's his Headless God concept.
Mm-hmm.
I read that and it just blew me away. I was just like, oh my God, what is this idea? It just spoke to me. And for many reasons, I'm sure. I was raised Catholic, and there's Christian tones layered in there. Mm-hmm. But could you, I guess, for the audience, perhaps explain this idea of the Headless God?
Yeah, the Headless God is the notion that the God concept is itself undergoing a developmental transformation process that keeps sort of being one God concept emerges and then it gets deconstructed, but then another one arises to take its place. It's sort of, beyond the previous one, and this process unfolds and unfolds, so that God is always sort of on his way to the guillotine, as it were. He's always getting his head chopped off, but he's always rising 3 days later. And the fact that there's this eternally transcendent aspect to this kind of shifting notion of the divine is itself a kind of meta concept that's worthy of reverence and awe, I would say, is what the Headless God refers to.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's great. And I'll include, for the description of this video, I'll include that segment about the Headless God in there so people can read, if that's okay with you, Brendan.
Sure.
Just that. And then a couple other of my favorite, perhaps, short passages from your work. Because, I also loved a lot of what you wrote, but that you refer to the Headless God. And I think what spoke to me about it was this idea, well, it's a very, I don't say romantic, but it is this mythic kind of idea of a God willingly going to the guillotine to have its head chopped off time and time again. Mm-hmm. And I think, I'm not sure, you have to correct me, but I would think the way Freinacht puts it is that even he would bend a knee to like that kind of courage or that kind of willingness to go over and have one's head chopped off. And I guess it's open to a bunch of different interpretations, but I saw that. I thought that was just a very powerful visual and a very, very powerful, we'll say, metaphor for, if your concept is willing, and I think metamodernism actually fits this bill, willing to continually go and have and be killed and then be reborn and then be killed and maybe be reborn.
Yeah.
That is a God. That's a concept that I can get behind, that I think resonates strong with me. Maybe it will for other people too.
Yeah. And that appears in the section on religion beyond religion, which is sort of a discussion of metamodern takes on religion and spirituality. And what I found really fascinating about all this, which I also relate to Greg Enriquez's work, which has a similar concept, and my own work. I wrote a whole epic poem called God. It was about the death of God and his resurrection of a new God concept. Right. There was just this incredible convergence, independent convergence to similar ideas, and that's always that's always compelling. When you feel like, okay, well, maybe there's something to this when all these other people are kind of on the same, following the same cue here.
Yeah, the same wavelength. Yeah.
And so in terms of thinking about distinctly metamodern conceptions of the sacred or the divine, I think that's a good sort of icon of what's going on there. Is that it's this transcendent move itself that is, iconographically sort of symbolized, that it's our icons of God that are continually being redestroyed, but then there's this sort of meta pattern that we can say that is like somehow stable in all of its continual dynamism and flux. And another way of thinking about it is really just that, Nietzsche's Death of God really is this sort of consummation or culmination of this sort of postmodern sentiment, and that is the deconstructive move ultimately, albeit expressed in mythic terms, right? But then you'd expect there to be a post-postmodern, i.e. metamodern reconstructive move that is the next, stage or the next step. And so instead of the death of God, you get the continual rebirth of God, the continual death and rebirth and death and rebirth of God. And I think that very much is certainly my conception that, of the divine, and I think it is a kind of distinctly metamodern conception of the divine, which also enfolds the notion of metamodernism itself in all this, right? Because it's like there is no sense of metamodernism being, oh, this is the final, way that it all works. This is the answer that we found it out. There's a built-in notion that like this is another stage, and it will go through its own recursive self-reflection process, where we can step outside the metamodern lens, see what it's missing, see its failures, and then critique and transcend it. And so you want a theory that sort of builds that into itself, from the get-go. If it's able to do that, it's ironically able to get closer to something more like, a universal truth in its own recognition that its framing of a universal truth will be undermined. It's sort of like Socrates, being wise because he knows he doesn't know anything. That sort of
Right.
move, right? And there's this kind of
Yeah.
Gödelian move of like, the theory is always incomplete, but when you have a recognition that like that's a stable aspect of the theory itself, it folds itself in. So, yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I love that the way you brought in it, and then a girdle as well. And I think before I have another thing to get to on the book. Have you ever? This is a complete side question. Have you ever played the video game Skyrim?
No, I heard of it.
It's great. It's my favorite game of all time. It's so great, but it starts off with the very first intro scene is you're at a guillotine and you're about to get your head chopped off, and right before it happens, a dragon comes and all hell breaks loose, and you're able to escape.
Nice.
And that's what I think. And I just started playing it again, so I think that's perhaps part of the reason why this Headless God thing is hitting me so hard, because it's like you were just about to be killed and you're saved, and there's a very much a Campbellian hero's journey kind of thing of saved from the clutches of death, and what do you do then, right? Now, I think the idea of the Headless God is that most of the time your head is getting chopped off. So like, what do you do next? How do you respond? Well, how do you face the guillotine? I think is a wonderful, beautiful question as well. Do you face it with mercy, towards your captors or whatever, or do you? It's a reflection there too.
Yeah, yeah. If you're going kicking and screaming to the guillotine, then it means that you're too committed to your own self, which is to say you're too committed to a particular image or idea that you think is absolute, that you're not going to let die. But ironically, it's the death of a concept that allows it to be transcended. So I think that there's something very profound in that can really weave in very beautifully with Christian, mythology and tradition. I mean, there was a period of time where that was very much a kind of theological angle that I was interested in pursuing, and not alone or the first to do so. There's a whole death of God theological tradition, even that started, in the 60s. And also I'd mentioned the work of Jean-Luc Marion and other people, but of basically reinterpreting the crucifixion as a version of this, right? There's something about the idea of a God being put to death that can operate at sort of a meta level, that it's not just that we're celebrating the crucifixion as a core element of a given religion. We're celebrating the death of religion itself, and the rebirth of something beyond that on the other side. That to me is something I can find great reverence for, because when you reflect on history and you reflect on cultural production over time, you see the process and you see it happen. And you see the transformation and the evolution of perspectives over time, and you see their transcendence through time. And so you would want, at least I do, a notion of the sacred that can reflect that and adequately live up to it. So that's a big part of the book that I'm currently writing, actually, is like, you could basically say, it's called The Evolution of Meaning, but it's basically looking at the different times you could say that God has gone to the guillotine and then, been reborn 3 days later, which is to say, how does the God concept itself shift, evolve, and complexify through time, through the kind of recursive, iterative process that I'm talking about. Which is also a lot of what Emergentism was about. So
perfect. Yeah, I can't wait to get my hands on that bad boy. Yeah. I forget who said it. There's some saying, and I can't remember the quote, but it's something like, your physical death should not be your first death, or something like that. You have to die many times in life and be reborn. You don't want to wait to the end to actually die, or something of that degree. And so one of the things, just moving on to one of my favorite excerpts from your book, and was the example you give where, to explain going meta, what that would mean is someone stepping out of the painting that they're in getting in, being in an art gallery, and then climbing out of that and realizing they were in a television. So they're in someone's the living room, and they've stepped out, right? And they're looking now at the TV that contained the art gallery that they're in, that contained the painting that they're in, and how all of these, and from that vantage point that actually contains more than just the context of the painting.
Yeah.
I love that, which is a beautiful, succinct way, and it's good visual to kind of take it all in. Did I get that right, or do you want to expound on that idea?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think it's just a helpful way of talking about this going meta process. So you're if you imagine someone coming out of a painting and then able to kind of turn around, look back, and see the frame that they had been encased in, then they're sort of like, oh, okay, I see the bigger picture now, so to speak, and maybe quite literally, right? And so now that vantage has not just the painting, but the context of the painting, the relationality, what the painting is in relation to is now part of the vantage. But this process can repeat iteratively. So then now that person steps out of, as you say, the television, and they look and they say, oh, okay, I had been in this gallery that the painting was in, but now I'm in someone's living room looking at the television that has the gallery that has the painting. And now I can see what the gallery is in relation to, so to speak. And this process can, again, iterate and grow on itself, so that the more you do this, the more information you're sort of reflecting on then. Because now if you're standing in that living room, you're seeing the living room, you're seeing the television, you're seeing the gallery, and you're seeing the painting. And none of that was really in your ken before, when you were just in the painting. So there is a sense of progression, and there's a sense of getting more of the picture here, which I think is a genuine way of looking at these cultural shifts, these shifts in cultural logic, right? So, the pre-modern world, operating largely from, say, more kind of mythological religious frameworks, they lived in a story, and that was very much the mythological world. And then modernity comes along, and you sort of climb out of the story, and then you can look at the story as a story and reflect on it as a story. And then you're like, oh, okay. And then you can do things like, historical criticism, and you can look at the texts of the story that you were reading and study where they came from and treat them historically and all this stuff, right? And it gives you a new vantage. And then you do all sorts of kind of scientific studies, and you find new ways of thinking about reality. But then you do the same move again, and you move from a kind of modern, scientific, historically minded, we'll get the truth if we study sort of approach, to this postmodern perspective that's able to say, hey, wait a second, that's another story that, and I just climbed out of it. Maybe you can't see that, but you're inhabiting your own story with a bunch of presumptions and presuppositions that are all built into your scholarship and your worldview that you're just not seeing, right? Like, why are you studying these stories and not other stories? I mean, the question you asked me earlier about weird, right? Like, that comes from a postmodern vantage of being like, hey, wait a second, right? And as long as we're doing psychology studies and thinking we have all this great data, we're going to be revealing something about the world that we think is universal, when in fact it's actually a very narrow, specific thing. So you need to step back again and be like, hey, wait a second. Actually, what we know a lot about is a bunch of white undergrads studying psychology. We know a lot about them because that's who we're studying. But what about all these other people, right? So then you're constantly relativizing what you thought was absolute, because you're always putting things in new relationships to a formerly missing context. So you get to the postmodern vantage and you see that, but then you're kind of faced with this relativism. You're faced with, okay, well, wait a second, but if this is a story and that was a story, then like, how do we know that, one story is the one to believe when everything is just stories? And basically you get this radical, relativization of truth, that is very disorienting and can lead to nihilism. It can lead to just a kind of profound disorientation. So what metamodernism represents is a further stepping back out of that story to be able to reflect now on the postmodern vantage and say, here are all the things that you're missing, even from this high vantage where you see, you're reflecting on the modernist, and the modernist is reflecting on the pre-modern and all this stuff. But the metamodern at least endeavors to put all that in context. And in the way that it does so, I think, is through the process itself. It says, what are all these things doing? Well, they're doing this movement of recursive self-reflection. So the postmodernists didn't necessarily see that, and maybe is actually uncomfortable by the idea. But once you do see it, then you can actually say, well, we gain more information the more recursively we reflect. So there's something to be said. There's a reason why the postmodernist is justified critiquing the modernists in that psychology study, because they have more of the picture that they're bringing, right? And so the ideal would be the metamodernist could say, okay, postmodernists, yes, you're right, but you're also missing a bunch. And my claim in the book is basically that, which isn't entirely, novel either. It's my own formulation of a lot of what these folks are getting at in talking about metamodernism, is that what we use as our universal metric is how many levels decentered you are, how many times you've recursively reflected. And if you're able to toggle into the pre-modern perspective, toggle into the modern and the postmodern, if you're able to articulate the advantages of all of those and then get beyond it, that's the best sign that you have for you're on the right track, because that's the presumption inherent in the whole cultural history to date. So that would be the idea. And what it ultimately does, I think, is it relativizes relativism, it contextualizes the emphasis on context, and it actually sits it in a kind of new absolute structure that we can gain some bearings through. It's not an absolute structure in like a foundationalist sense. It's not like we go back to I think therefore I am, and then we build off a whole knowledge structure based off of some unshakable truth. It's rather a relative basis of the absolute, kind of the way relativity theory is, in terms of like, well, there's this speed of light and everything's relative to that, and everything then is relative to each other. But we have this kind of shared yardstick. So yeah, that's the basic idea.
That's interesting. Yeah, and how do you know? This person who was in the painting in the art gallery, then in the living room of the television they were in. How do they know when to stop? Just pulling themselves out.
So there's two things to that, I guess. So one, I think I'll answer this first, and then I'll get to that. Is first the question I would say is like, how do you know that you're even doing this, right? And I think the answer to that is if you can enact the movements that have come before, and then you'll also find, and this is the great work of Jason Storm, he basically goes the next step into metamodernism by reduplicating the logic of postmodernism on itself. This is why it's a recursive thing as well. So it's not arbitrary what this recursive reflection process looks like. It's actually like, if you get postmodernism so well that you can apply postmodernism to itself, then you'll get metamodernism, right? And that's an interesting thing. Now, then the question is, as you ask, okay, well, when do you stop? I guess I would say, well, why should we stop? Other than at a personal, individual level, like what we were getting at earlier in terms of being hyper self-conscious, I think that's a little different. For me, talking about cultural logic shifts, I don't necessarily see any downside to gaining more context, but I'm up to exploring that. I mean, there's an interesting way in which even certain recursive moves that can lead to really negative consequences still serve a function. There is something, I think, kind of inherently nihilistic in the relativism that gets produced at the postmodern level of recursive reflection. But I think that's a necessary stage to get, to the next higher level, where you see that, you have to deconstruct all your ideas first so that you know what that means, because that's the only way you can understand this deeper, higher process of transcendence itself. So short answer is, I can't see any need or desire to miss out on more information, right? Because to the degree that we've done this recursive decentration thing, we have, when used well, been able to harness the greater context and information towards greater human flourishing. Now, that's not inevitable, but that is a new capacity that we gain, right? So when you're outside of your mythic story and you're able to see that there are other mythic stories, then you're in a position to have something like universal human rights. We're all humans, right? We're not necessarily Christians. We're not necessarily Muslims or Jews or what have you, but we're all human, and we can see that as our common basis for like some deep value structure. And you know, then when you decenter more and you get to a postmodern vantage, you see more people that are being left out of the story. You have more context, and so you have more ability potentially to act on that context to basically find more successful ways for an integration for greater flourishing. So I think one of the reasons I would say that there might be cause not to keep recursively reflecting is that we do find greater causal power on the other side of these reflections. And if that isn't married to ethical wisdom and a deeper sense of a kind of a really profound sense of the importance of the whole thing, then we basically find ourselves more and more in the situation that we're in, which I think E.O. Wilson said, you know, we're like primates that have like Paleolithic emotions and godlike technology, right? And this sort of a thing.
Yeah,
So,
right.
so that's really the danger, such as it is just that we could get to a point where we have so much power, but we haven't necessarily really integrated the wisdom to be able to appropriately use and harness that power, and we create greater existential risk.
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing I wonder about, I was thinking about this when I was reading it for the first time too. As you step out of, and I'm going to keep with this, the painting. And have you actually seen MC Escher's art gallery? You ever seen that?
No, but I grew up with Escher. I love Escher, so that's probably not
my gosh.
an accident.
Speaking of Gödel, it was in Gödel Escher Bach, and it's an interesting image the way he created it. It's a little tough to see actually, unless you get, say, an animated version of it, in my opinion. But it's a person standing in an art gallery, and they're looking at themselves in an art gallery, and it really helps if you see it animated, in my opinion, because static image is really tough to see. And there's, you know, a tiny point in the painting where it's just like a black hole. It can't go any further because it breaks down at some point. Yep. But it just came to memory because we were making this art, this person that's stepping out of the painting and getting all these places. There's a lot of context, or it says more information, but then aren't you losing the resolution of the painting? You know, as you step out of it,
yes.
You know, you're the person that used to say live in that space. I guess you have to remember what that space was like and what that feeling was like to be in it. How do you balance those
ideas? That's a wonderful continuation of that image in a way that captures another really important aspect of this, which is that, yes, you do lose that resolution, and you become further and further away from where you came from. And so that is a danger, because at a certain point, then you're not actually, really integrating that information anymore. It's sort of, it's just kind of blurs out. This is really interesting. I mean, I think that there are versions of this throughout evolutionary history, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but in local instances, it can be. So what do I mean by that? I think something like this process occurs even at sort of almost like a preconscious level in the complexification of entities over evolutionary history. And one example is sort of like at a certain moment in evolutionary cognitive history, probably like the cutting edge, let's say, would have been let's say like a kind of reflex reaction that kicks in when there's a particular stimulus, and that's just sort of like like a form of learning that's very kind of reflexive in the sense of a reflex, not recursion. But then you kind of get further down the evolutionary chain, And that's not as important anymore. You don't have to. That's not the cutting edge. It's not. It's not. That's not even where the environmental niche makes its demands on you. And so you can kind of just like the degree to which that can be automatized, which it already is, basically like an automatic reflex, and basically, yeah, like just not thought about is fine, because there's higher level processing that you have to do. If I had to think about my heart beating every single beat, like that would, make incredible strains on my physiology that I wouldn't be able to do other things. And, so anyway, what am I getting at is just that, that process seems to be always unfolding. We're always sort of losing things into that black hole of loss of resolution. And that's sort of okay if there's higher information processing going on that's utilizing that sort of greater resolution at the forefront. Where it becomes really problematic, though, is when you're in a particular scale where it really would be evolutionary advantageous to be able to draw from that informational resource. For example, a lot of, I think, the problems that we're facing right now in the world is differing layers, differing degrees of self-reflection, recursive self-reflection going on at a cultural level, but individual level as well. And if you do look at cultural logic shifts as being ones of increasing self-reflection, and where you're kind of on the spectrum from the pre-modern to the metamodern, then operating with like a pre-modern mentality in a very complex environment, we're also dealing with people who are very reflexive, self-reflexive, creates all these disharmonies, right? So like postmodernists critique pre-modern thinkers for being, racist and xenophobic and homophobic and whatnot, right? And that comes from that higher level of reflection. They're able to reflect on those lenses, whereas that other person's just seeing through it, and that's their world. Now, that creates tension. So one of the things that would be ideal is if people were more adept at being able to toggle into these different perspectives themselves, so that they would have greater compassion, understanding, etc. Because if you can't see the pre-modern perspective anymore because you've just reflected totally beyond it, you're not able to really interface with that, and then there's just cultural tension, and the kinds of cultural divisions that we see in the world, are largely a basis of this. And so all the kinds of geopolitical struggles, that go on between industrialized modern nation states, and indigenous societies where these things break down, or various kinds of, modern states versus, kind of pre-modern religious, theocratic mentalities, or postmodern versus sort of, modern capitalistic and industrialization. All these things, these sort of cultural logics in tension, are often based on the lack of the ability to properly integrate the information from those prior levels into the current level. So then there really is challenge, and there's an evolutionary, environmental, adaptive sort of push to to ideally be able to integrate that more completely. So that, I think, is something that, unless you even have the picture in your mind of how that kind of works, you're not even going to begin to know how to resolve that issue, right? And I think this is where the postmodernists go wrong, because they just look at, those backwards, Christians in rural America or whatever, when will they learn, blah, 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 blah. There isn't really any kind of empathy or compassion or understanding for that given mindset and how it works in a particular cultural logic. And so it creates, it creates confusion and tension. So if you see that there is this sort of, evolving set of cultural logics through reflection, then you're at least able to kind of get a sense for, how could we deal with these kinds of deep divisive issues by being able to go into these perspectives and inhabit them and see what's going on there and take them seriously. And a lot of the work of Hanzi Freinacht really is about just that. I mean, that's what a listening society would be aiming towards. Ironically, there's a pushback from postmodernists to be able to get to deeper listening and understanding among these different cultural logics, because they don't like the idea of any kind of there being a given spectrum or scale or universal way of thinking about this. It's too, in their minds, too totalizing, too kind of modernist in its perspective. So there's sort of a limit there. But anyway, that's a long-winded approach or answer to talking about the issue of losing that resolution, right, and when it's particularly valid and urgent to regain some higher resolution, and when it's not.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. Thank you for bringing that into such a present day kind of the present day wars that we have going on now. So yeah, that's an interesting link there. One thing I want to ask you about, it's very 180, but back to Hanzi Freinacht. Because I don't know anything about him. I didn't know anything about him until I read your book. And but I did see you had a YouTube video where you did include him in there. Is he being tongue-in-cheek with his like debonair, over the big beard? Is he in on? Is he in on? I don't want to say it's a joke, but is he in on it?
Oh yeah, it's all
okay. I think it's got the sense, yes.
Yes. So to be clear, also, Hanzi Freinacht is not a person. He's a pen name. He's a character invented by these two thinkers, and so this is a great case of sincere irony, right? Is that
okay? Good.
These guys know, they're like, hey, we're just like two, one's Swedish and anyway, we're two white guys, one's a sociologist, and we love the romantic image of like the wise philosopher roaming the Alps, right? But like it's so pretentious and silly, we could never ourselves do it. Okay. But we're going to perform that way because in the same way we were talking about earlier about sort of owning your cringe, there's a certain level of like you can perform your own earnest aspirations through irony. So this is one of the elements I think that the kind of the cultural studies people maybe also don't understand about the Hanzi Freinacht stuff, is that it's not just talking about metamodernism. It's not just talking about metamodern philosophy. It's doing metamodern philosophy. It's using the very concept of sincere irony to then talk about metamodernism. So there's a whole other level going on there of performance and the performativity, the performatism of it. And when you get it, then it's sort of like, oh, okay, he's playing like a Nietzsche character, right? This is this aspirational thing. And then the question is like, does it work? And I think it does. Like if the book were just written by these two guys, it'd be like, oh, that's a good book. They have some good ideas, right? But when you write a book and it's written by this character and he's sort of larger than life and it's this whole conceit and it's a pretense and it's like, it takes it to a whole other level that makes it sort of enacts its own mythology. And I think it's very brilliant.
Gotcha. So that's an actor. That's not a person.
Yeah. Originally they based it. Well, they originally based it off of this male model who actually went on to be in. He played Skinny Santa, but then eventually they're like, all right, we can't keep basing it on this model, so they just drew a picture of this figure. And but for my video, I was actually able to find some video of that model, and so I used that. Yeah, so it's that's why there are these ridiculous shots of him on like the rolled up shorts and everything. It's just ridiculous, but like that's the whole point.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. I was pretty sure that it was an in-joke.
Yeah.
But not totally sure.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting thing. And I actually think that touches on something with the metamodern media that you've referenced a lot in your work, which I think is a great touch point. When you bring in stuff from pop culture and it's, okay, this is a solid thing that I can understand, that I can actually grapple with, and maybe perhaps my audience does as well. I'm not sure enough is made of the fact that, you do mention it a lot, that the Best Picture winner this past year, Everything Everywhere All at Once, was explicitly stated by the directors as a metamodern film.
Yeah.
That seems like a huge win for metamodernism to me. And it's mentioned, it's kind of here and there, but if I've mentioned that to my friends, they say, what the hell are you talking about? Right? They don't really know what I mean. And so, it's something that but I bring back the media because in other ways, though, too, and this is a personal opinion, but half, maybe more than half of the metamodern media that's typically referenced, and I actually pulled it out from your book, I despise. I hate it. I cannot stand it. And I mean, I'll talk about which ones I really hate. And then Everything Everywhere at Once, actually, I liked. I enjoyed. I thought it was a little overhyped, to be honest. I thought it wasn't my best picture winner. Yeah. Michelle Yeoh was incredible. She totally deserves the Oscar. But I thought the movie was good, but I thought it was like a little overdone. But the reference, the ones I hated, well, let's start with the ones I loved, because I loved Ted Lasso, loved Life of Pi. Those are great. Ones I hated, Moonrise Kingdom, couldn't stand it. The Lego Movie, Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. All movies I despised. Absolutely could not stand. Which I think actually potentially gets to how like a razor's edge it is, in my opinion. Actually, well, just my personal experience with this media, that it's so close to working and not working. Seems like a high wire act a little bit, you know, or even does this resonate at all? Do you know?
So I'd love to hear a little bit about why those particular things didn't land for you. But I do think what you're naming is right, which is, and it's actually a great thing. We were just talking about Hanzi, and it's like if you don't get the Hanzi joke, then it creates this big problem. And some people are like, "Oh, I don't like this," and then they get it, and they're like, "Oh, okay." And then it kind of opens up this new thing. And I wonder if something like that is going on for these other films, right? Because like you could watch, let's say, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, and you could just be like, "This is dumb," you know, or you could be like for me, when it was like, "Oh, this is very interesting." He's playing himself, you know, in his own washed up reality, and he is literally making this movie for the reason why in the movie he's making his movie, because he needs money because he's in debt. So he's, you know, so it becomes this very, very self-reflexive, self-aware thing. The reason why I cast that movie in like a metamodern light as more of, instead of just like a postmodern one, is because there's something very earnest about it, right? It's not you know, there's one of the key differences between postmodern films and metamodern films is they can use the same tactic of like being hyper self-aware, but to what end is sort of the question you have to ask. And a lot of postmodern films use the hyper self-awareness, but then it kind of just ends in absurdity, or just kind of like oh, that was very clever, but ultimately like you can just see this Hall of Mirrors thing, and it's kind of you know. Whereas metamodern films do similar stuff, but they somehow tie it in with like, you kind of feel good. You feel like this matters. This is like, and so at the end of that movie, right, he's like with his family and he's watching this movie together, and they're all kind of brought together by this journey. And it's like, but it was such a ridiculous thing. Anyway, I could go on and on, but that would be sort of one of the key things, is like when you can see what's going on there and you see what they're up to, I think that it does become a bit more, something shifts, would be my like for example, Tim and Eric. I don't know how you feel about Tim and Eric Awesome Show. I'm not sure if you're aware of
I'm a little familiar, but I really haven't seen much of it.
Some people love it and some people hate it, and I do find that there's a moment when people realize that there's another layer that then they start to love it instead of hate it. It's sort of like if someone just makes like stupid scatological jokes, you know, like pee pee poo poo, you know, if you're like, that's not funny, that's just immature. But then once you become aware that that person made that joke in a self-awareness of that being the dynamic and then playing into that dynamic, then it's a different work at that point. You're interpreting it differently, and you're assigning it different criteria for assessing its value. So that would be my thought about that. But I'd have to know why those movies, just why you despise them.
Yeah, I'd have to break them down one by one. I guess with Wes Anderson, I have a love-hate relationship with his movies in general. His catalog, half I've loved, half have not worked for me. And I've made it a point that unless it's a very different style, or I'm not going to see another Wes Anderson movie for the rest of my life. I've seen it. I
Yeah.
know what he's going to do.
Yeah.
Evolve, man, please. I should have critiqued. He's a wonderful director, obviously. As armchair criticism, but yeah,
so that's so I'm getting there too with his newer films. I feel like he's perfected himself, that he's now becoming sort of a caricature of his own style, and so that does get a bit old. Life Aquatic is from, I think, that's actually my favorite movie actually of all time. There's something about that. Yeah,
wow. Yeah.
Oh no! Hey, but there's a lot to get into why that is all the case and everything. But I would say that his early stuff, he's finding it. It's not so perfect there. But the more important or the more interesting thought there is that you're naming the dynamic, I think, by means of which metamodernism is also going to be moved beyond. Right? These things they become reified, they become their own thing, and then people get tired of them, and they're like, okay, give me some more cynicism, please, and so and then we're back into this whole other thing. But in order for it not to just be postmodern cynicism, it's got to be a form of metamodern cynicism that kind of somehow circle backs. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we're actually moving more into cynicism, because if you look at like the Everything Everywhere All at Once film, there's still something deeply postmodern. It's that's like an edge case that it does ultimately land on the metamodern side, but in a way that I feel like there's still a lot of nihilism in there. It's sort of like it's the upside of nihilism. It's like nothing matters, therefore, this is all great. I think that you go through that, and then you get to a more affirmational form of metamodernism, which might then become this kind of hyper-saccharine thing that people just it's going to be too much, and then we're going to see another reaction to that. But
it'll keep changing. Yeah, it's interesting.
I have to head out soonish, but I'm good for another question or two if you want to.
All right, another question or two. I don't know if we're going to have a chance to. Actually, you answered some of these. I'm just looking at some of my. I do want to touch on, and please stop whenever you have to jump off, but. Integral theory, so Ken Wilber's work, and it's something that's come up. I've probably been cognizant of this concept for a couple of years now. Every once in a while, I'll dive into it, do some reading, watch a video or two. I tried reading was it Sex, Ecology, and Religion? I think
Spirituality.
Spirituality. Yep. And it does not resonate at all with me. I see the AQual chart. I see some of the stuff, and I don't know what's going on here. But obviously it was and still is quite popular. There's a lot of people you talked about, and you're on someone's podcast or someone was on yours, where you talked about integral and metamodernism and some of the overlaps and some of the confusions. So can you give, I don't know, it's very quick overview of sort of why there is this kind of thing, why integral is so important, what's resonating with people about it?
Yeah. Well, the first issue, most importantly, is why is there this overlap? And the explanation for that is that integral theory also offers a way of thinking about what comes after postmodernism. When metamodernism shows up on the scene, it shows up in cultural studies, and that's coming from its own lineage of, its its own siloed lineage that it's dealing with its own writers and ideas and all that. And then over here, outside of the academy, you've got, but deeply informed by, intellectual writings and intellectual history, you've got Ken Wilber developing integral theory, and he's also talking about something moving out of postmodernism, and he's identifying similar patterns. So that's why they're nominally related. Now, integral theory, so then this becomes really complicated because integral theory is a hard thing to summarize. And I think it has both wonderful and terrible aspects. The most wonderful aspects of it are that it's trying to do something very comprehensive. It's trying to situate basically all the forms of human knowledge together and to integrate them. And it values that integration. And so it values greater information, greater context, and all that. And so there's some similarity there too. And And it also is framing it as a kind of nested structure in which these things evolve one to the next and whatnot. So all that's really great, and the AQual map, at least the 4 quadrants, let's say, is a wonderful epistemological tool. When we were talking earlier about self-reflection and the issue of, well, there's individual self-reflection and there's cultural self-reflection, like the 4 quadrants becomes really helpful to like parse those differences and then to be able to see also how they're related. So there's some really great intellectual tools that come out of it. So it becomes a sort of it's gesturing towards a sort of theory of everything, and to that degree, a lot of people that you have on this podcast, I think are operating in a similar field, a similar scale of analysis. Trying to think about these big, like, what are the dynamics that hold across the whole thing, starting with the Big Bang and going to all, how do we bring it all in? Mm-hmm. So I think all that's very commendable. The downsides to integral theory, from my perspective, are it comes out of a particular moment in place, namely Boulder, Colorado specifically, and sort of the 90s, that there's sort of a kind of new age bent to it. And because it's operating outside of the academy and it's operating in the context of like evolution of consciousness theories and that sort of stuff, brings in a lot of stuff that is of varying degrees of sort of empirical validity, let's say. So like, so you wind up getting, you're talking about Piaget one moment, and then you're talking about Sri Aurobindo the next moment, and like mega mind and this sort of thing. And then like on top of the quadrants, like it's not just the world we experience, it's also the subtle realms and the causal realms and the non-duality. So it goes into this whole domain of phenomena that are just outside the purview of the academy and of sort of like science. And because of that, one, the theory itself arguably becomes a bit unwieldy, maybe. Certainly, though, the people who get attracted to the theory increasingly come from more like New Age contexts, who are less interested in finding like rigorous theories of everything, and they're more interested in sort of finding intellectual frameworks for grounding spiritual experiences. So these communities just really drift apart in terms of what they're up to, that by the end of it, you've still got the people in the academy talking about what comes after postmodernism, but now integral theory is like, what about ghosts and aliens? And, what about the time that my third eye chakra, when it, and it's like, whoa, these are very different discourses. So one of the things that happened, though, is that Hanzi Freinacht, the people who make up Hanzi Freinacht, found a lot of value in the integral framework, in its more rigorous, theory of everything approach. It's meta theory, basically, approach. But they didn't like all the wooey stuff that came in as well. And they actually had friends and close friends that basically suffered a lot from some of the stuff that was going on with all that. And so they were basically like, there's some gold here, but it's got all this dross. So like, let's also, and a lot of the gold was basically the developmental aspect that Wilber had picked up from Piaget and Habermas. And that's also where I think the gold is as well, for the reasons a little bit that I get into the book, is that I think we can't talk about the cultural evolution if we're not talking about psychological transformation, psychological shifts and development. So basically, the Hanzi Freinacht stuff is one way of looking at it. Is it's trying to take some of that good stuff, from integral, and not let it go too crazy. So, like in integral theory, you go up from there's Piaget's stages of pre-operational thought, concrete operational thought, formal operational thought, and then you get into like you get these spiritual domains of like now we're in like choral, and now we're into these radiant zones of consciousness and stuff, and it's like there's no empirical basis for that in a scientific sense, right? People might have experiences, but like Piaget was doing research, right? So Hanzi Freinacht works off of a neo-Piagetian tradition called the model of hierarchical complexity that actually is empirically grounded and can go into higher stage thought. And so he actually links metamodernism, the cultural level, with the individual developmental stage of the meta-systematic form of. Now, this would get way too much into the weeds to go much further than that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
But that's kind of some of the connection.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, that's perfect encapsulation, because I was very confused. Not confused. I could see enough similarities in there, and it is still something that I'm sure will keep popping up as it does for you.
Yeah. And one more thing I'll say about that is I find it very compelling, and I'm a big part of my work right now is doing this, is exploring it, of trying to tease out the relationship of the individual and the collective in terms of development, right? And this is what Habermas was doing as well, like using the work of Piaget, Kohlberg, talking about moral and intellectual development, cognitive development, and then looking at how cultural structures and systems and institutions show up that somehow embody these changing ideas and ideals. And the fact that we have things like the model of hierarchical complexity and other forms of neo-Piagetian developmental structures and maps is profound. And I feel like the research program that exists there just is waiting to be further explored, but done in a rigorous way, which gradually, arguably, the integral theory kind of lost touch with. And so I do think that there's a room for a metamodern sociological approach that is more rigorous about this. I'm doing research at the moment, which I'll get into later. It's coming out, but that is trying to do some of this stuff, and this book is trying to do some of this stuff, because one of the difficulties is you wind up making broad general statements about reality, like, just this human individual stage of development maps to this collective stage, and then it's like, how, on what basis can we say that? What are the evidentiary, all this stuff, like what would we need to do to make that kind of claim credible in any kind of more rigorous way? I think that's just work waiting to be done. And I think it's very valuable work. And once it's done well and done appropriately and responsibly, I think there will be more reception to it in the academy. So I think some of the metamodern discourse can help bridge some of those things a bit.
Cool. That's amazing. Thank you. And before I let you go, I do want to ask you about, because you had an announcement in the last week or two about the Meadow Institute.
Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind giving us a quick pitch on that, that'd be wonderful to hear.
Yeah, and this will relate a lot to the stuff that you're interested in and this channel is devoted to. Meadow is a retreat center that I run in Vermont. And I've just launched Meadow Institute, which is sort of run out of the retreat center. That's sort of dedicated to, using the place here and all the kinds of resources to promote and advance sort of systems-based, complexity, processual forms of thought about the stuff that really matters most. It's kind of how I pitch it. So religion, what does that look like through a more holistic relational complexity lens? Politics, ecology, right? There's permaculture here and stuff, and organic gardens, and trying to look at like life through a systems and complexity lens in every way, and trying to do research and whatnot that'll promote that and expand and advance that. So it comes with this new initiative. We're starting a press. I'll be publishing some people's work along this lines. I already mentioned I'm doing my own research. And we're also hosting, retreats from people in this space, in this community. Benita Roy is going to be doing 3 retreats here. There's the Metamodern Spirituality Labs that are happening here. So I'm just trying to use this incredible, beautiful 115-acre retreat center as this hub, hopefully, to be kind of like a metamodern Esalen, get people in here and develop ideas. And I mentioned earlier the problems that we're facing collectively and the tension and the breakdown of things. And what we need is metamodern institutions that are operating at a very high level of recursive reflection, that are able to take in a lot of the informational context as much as possible anyway, and to try to generate solutions with all of that additional information and in contextual awareness. So that's the hope. And we're just kind of trying to be a part of this broader institutional infrastructure that hopefully starts to come online as we face issues of existential risk and a meta crisis and a meaning crisis and all sorts of crises, trying to do something that helps.
Yeah. That's wonderful. It's so exciting. I can't wait to see what comes down the pipeline for that, and I'll make sure to watch that space.
Well,
and
how far away are you? What state are you in, if you don't mind sharing that?
Oh, I don't mind it. I'm in New York City.
New York City. Okay. Yeah. So you're not far. We'd love to have you up here. Consider it an open invitation, and we can talk, you and I. But yeah, if you ever wanted to do anything here, these are the sorts of voices we want to bring in and the kind of ideas we want to, propagate. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Amazing. Yeah, I'll definitely keep that in mind. Yeah, I go back to Massachusetts all the time. My family's there, so I'm in New England quite a bit.
Cool.
And thank you. And before I let you go, I just want to plug again the book for folks. Please, go out and read it. I'll link below in the description for people to check out the book. Anything else? Any parting words?
Just thanks for this. I hope people found it intelligible. You're a very incisive interviewer, and so we really get into the depths. And so I feel like this is a great thing if especially if someone's maybe already read the book and they're going for a deeper dive. But hopefully I was able to communicate some of the ideas somewhat intelligently, coherently. But I just appreciate the opportunity, and just to say that your podcast is excellent, and the quality of guests that you have and the quality of discussions that you have are just really wonderful. So I think you're doing a really great service for this space, and honored to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you, Brendan. I appreciate that so much. It's so kind of you to say, and I am so envious of your output. I cannot believe you wrote this book in 4 weeks. That's incredible. I wish I had your level of, productivity, and I can't wait to continue to follow your work, and I'm sure we'll engage again more in the future. I so enjoyed our first conversation earlier this year. This was a joy as well, and I hope the audience loves it as much as I did.
Awesome. Thank you, my friend. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, stay well. Thank you again.